The year is 1930. We find ourselves in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of northern Canada, a place where the world feels raw and unfinished. This is the land of the Arctic, a realm of crushing cold and profound isolation. The landscape stretches on for endless miles, a stark canvas of white snow and jagged black rock, all under a sky that can feel both beautiful and menacing. The wind is a constant presence here, a mournful whisper that scours the frozen earth, carrying with it the scent of ice and pine. It's a sound that can get inside your head, making you feel like the last person on earth. This is a place where survival is not a given, but a daily battle against the elements. Imagine the loneliness. The sun hangs low on the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows that dance and twist across the snowdrifts. For months, darkness reigns supreme, broken only by the shimmering, spectral dance of the aurora borealis. The silence is so deep, so absolute, that it becomes a physical weight. You can hear the beat of your own heart, the rush of blood in your ears, the crackle of your breath crystallizing in the frigid air. It's a silence that amplifies every fear, every doubt. In this immense emptiness, civilization is a distant memory, a faint dream from another world. This is the setting for one of the most chilling and inexplicable mysteries of all time. This brutal, beautiful land was home to a small, thriving community of Inuit people. They knew this territory intimately, understanding its rhythms and its dangers in a way no outsider ever could. They lived in harmony with the unforgiving nature surrounding them, their lives dictated by the seasons, the hunt, and the ancient traditions passed down through generations. They were masters of survival, resilient and resourceful. Their village, nestled on the shores of Anjikuni Lake, was a small beacon of life in the midst of an immense frozen void. It was a place of family, of community, of shared stories under the northern lights. But something went terribly wrong. On a cold day in November 1930, that beacon of life was extinguished. The silence that fell over the village was different from the usual quiet of the Arctic. It was a dead silence, an unnatural stillness that spoke of an abrupt and terrifying end. The wind still howled, and the ice on the lake still cracked and groaned, but the sounds of human life, the laughter of children, the chatter of families, the barking of sled dogs were gone. They had vanished seemingly into thin air, leaving behind a ghost town frozen in its final moments, a haunting monument to an unanswered question. Our story truly begins with a man named Joe LaBelle. LaBelle was a seasoned fur trapper, a rugged soul accustomed to the harsh realities of the Canadian North. He knew the land like the back of his hand, and he knew the people who called it home. He was making his way through the territory on his trapline, the solitude his constant companion. As he neared the shores of Anjikuni Lake, he expected to find the familiar sights and sounds of the Inuit village he often visited for trade and rest. He anticipated the warm welcome, the smell of wood smoke, the lively energy of a community that had become a familiar stop on his solitary journeys. But as he drew closer, a deep sense of unease began to creep over him. There was no smoke rising from the snow-covered igloos. There was no welcoming party of barking dogs rushing out to greet him, their tails wagging in excitement. The air was still, unnervingly so. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the landscape. LaBelle called out, his voice swallowed by the immense emptiness. No one answered. His calls were met only by the mournful sigh of the wind whipping across the frozen lake. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. Something was profoundly wrong here. This wasn't the quiet of a sleeping village, it was the quiet of a tomb. With caution, LaBelle entered the village limits. The place felt like a photograph, a moment captured and then abandoned. Snow had drifted against the doorways of the igloos, suggesting they had been untouched for some time. Sleds were left overturned as if their owners had dropped them and walked away without a second thought. A half-finished kayak frame sat exposed to the elements, its willow ribs like the skeleton of some strange beast. Every detail painted a picture of a community that had stopped in the middle of everyday life, a population that had simply ceased to exist in an instant. The feeling of being watched, of standing in a place where a great tragedy had occurred, was overwhelming. Lebel's heart pounded in his chest. He was a man who had faced down bears and survived brutal blizzards, but this was a different kind of fear. This was the fear of the unknown, the chilling realization that something beyond his understanding had taken place. He moved from one silent structure to another, his boots crunching in the snow, the only sound in a world that had gone completely mute. He was no longer just a trapper. He was an investigator, the first witness to a scene that would baffle authorities and fuel nightmares for decades to come. He was standing at the epicenter of a mystery that had just begun. Pushing aside the snow-caked hide flap of the first igloo, Joe Lebel stepped into a scene of eerie domesticity. What he saw inside sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the biting cold. A pot of blackened stew, now frozen solid, still hung over a long-dead fire pit. The food had clearly been simmering, ready for a family meal, but it had been left to spoil and freeze. It was as if the cook had been in the middle of preparing dinner and was suddenly called away, never to return. The abandonment was so sudden, so complete, that it defied all logic. No one, especially in this harsh environment, would ever willingly leave a hot meal to go to waste. He moved to another dwelling, and the unsettling pattern continued. In one igloo he found a child's small sealskin parka, left on a sleeping platform as if just taken off. Beside it lay a set of tiny unfinished boots, a needle still threaded with sinew stuck right into the leather. The image was heartbreakingly intimate, a snapshot of a mother's work interrupted mid-stitch. In another hut, rifles were found leaning against the wall, right where the hunters would have left them. These were not just tools, they were the very instruments of survival in the Arctic. To abandon them was to abandon life itself. No Inuit hunter would ever leave their rifle behind, not for any reason. The entire village was a collection of these chilling tableaus. Every hut he entered told the same impossible story. A community of roughly 30 men, women and children had vanished in the middle of their daily routines. They hadn't packed, they hadn't prepared for a journey, they had simply disappeared, leaving everything they owned behind. Their food stores were full, their clothing was neatly folded, and their tools were laid out, ready for use. It was a ghost village in the most literal sense, haunted by the presence of lives abruptly cut short. The air was thick with unanswered questions, with the silent screams of a people who were there one moment and gone the next. Lebel stood in the center of the silent village, overwhelmed by the sheer wrongness of it all. He was a practical man, but what he was seeing defied any practical explanation. This wasn't the sign of a planned migration or a hasty evacuation. This was something else entirely. It felt as if a silent, invisible wave had washed over the village, plucking every living soul from their lives and leaving everything else perfectly, terrifyingly in place. The scene was a violation of the natural order, an affront to the rules of survival that governed life in the north. He knew he had to get help, to report this impossible event to the outside world. As Joe Lebel continued his grim investigation, the clues he uncovered only deepened the mystery, pushing it further into the realm of the inexplicable. One of the most significant and disturbing discoveries was the complete absence of human tracks leading away from the village. The snow around the settlement was smooth and unbroken save for his own footprints. If the entire population of 30 people had walked away, they would have left a clear trail, a story written in the snow for anyone to read. But there was nothing. It was as if they had been lifted straight up into the sky, leaving no trace of their departure on the ground below. This lack of tracks created a logical paradox that was impossible to solve. How could a whole community, including children and the elderly, travel any distance in this harsh terrain without leaving a single mark? They didn't have their sleds, which were found abandoned in the village. They didn't have their kayaks, which were also left behind. The idea of them walking was the only remaining possibility, yet the pristine snow told a different story. It silently screamed that no one had walked out of this village. This single fact dismantled every rational theory of a planned or panicked departure, leaving only a void of terrifying possibilities in its wake. Further inspection raised even more questions about the state of mind of the villagers before they disappeared. While their homes were left in a state of suspended animation, their personal belongings, tools, clothing and vital supplies were all present and accounted for. These items were the key to their existence, the difference between life and death in the Arctic. For an entire community to abandon these possessions en masse suggested an event so sudden and so terrifying that the basic instincts of survival were completely overridden. What could possibly frighten a people so attuned to danger that they would flee into a frozen wasteland with nothing? The scene was a silent testament to a moment of pure, unadulterated panic, yet it was a panic that left no physical evidence of a struggle or a flight. It was a psychological puzzle box. The evidence suggested a sudden departure, but the lack of tracks suggested no departure at all. The presence of their most valuable survival gear suggested they didn't plan to leave, yet they were gone. Every clue contradicted the next, creating a web of confusion and fear. Labelle was staring at the aftermath of an impossible event, a story with a beginning and an end, but with the entire middle section ripped out, leaving only chilling silence. Perhaps the most visceral and disturbing part of Joe Labelle's discovery lay just beyond the silent igloos. In the Arctic, sled dogs are more than just animals. They are partners, lifelines, and cherished members of the community. They are essential for transportation, hunting, and protection. The bond between an Inuit hunter and his dog team is profound and unbreakable. Yet when Labelle searched for the village's dogs, he found a scene of heartbreaking tragedy. He discovered the frozen bodies of several teams of sled dogs, all tied to their posts at the edge of the village. They had starved to death. This discovery was utterly incomprehensible. For the Inuit, who revered their dogs, allowing them to starve would be an unthinkable act of cruelty and self-destruction. It would be like a farmer setting fire to his own fields. The dogs were their legs, their strength, their key to navigating the vast frozen world. To abandon them to such a slow and agonizing fate meant that whatever had happened to the villagers, it had prevented them from performing the most basic and crucial act of care for their animal companions. The image of those loyal animals waiting for masters who would never return is one of the most haunting aspects of the Anjikuni mystery. The state of the dogs added a new layer of impossibility to the puzzle. If the villagers had been forced to flee, why not take their dogs with them? Their sleds were right there. A dog team would have been their only hope of reaching another settlement or finding safety. If they were abducted, why would their captors leave the dogs behind to die? The starving animals served as a grim timestamp, indicating that the villagers had been gone for at least a week, maybe more. But it did nothing to explain the reason for their absence. It only deepened the sense of profound wrongness that permeated the entire scene. The silent, frozen forms of the dogs stood as a testament to the finality of the event. Their suffering was a physical manifestation of the village's disappearance. While the people had vanished without a trace, the dogs were a concrete piece of evidence, a brutal and undeniable confirmation that the community was not coming back. Their deaths were a secondary tragedy born from the primary mystery, a howl of despair that echoed across the silent landscape. For anyone who understands the culture of the North, the fate of the dogs is perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence that something truly terrible and unnatural occurred at Anjikuni Lake. The horror of Anjikuni Lake did not end with the empty homes and the dead dogs. As Joe LaBelle and later the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who were called to investigate, expanded their search, they made a discovery that was not just mysterious, but sacrilegious. The village's small ancestral burial ground, a sacred place normally treated with the utmost reverence, had been disturbed. The graves, which were typically marked by cairns of heavy stones to protect them from scavenging animals, had been opened. The stones were carefully removed and stacked neatly to the side, and the frozen earth had been dug up. Upon inspection, the investigators found that the graves were empty. The bodies of the village's ancestors had been removed. This was an act that defied all cultural and spiritual understanding of the Inuit people. Desecrating the resting place of one's elders was one of the greatest taboos imaginable. It was an act that would invite terrible misfortune and anger the spirits. No Inuit, under any circumstances, would ever commit such a sacrilege. The idea that the villagers themselves had done this was unthinkable, yet the careful stacking of the stones suggested it was not the work of animals. It was methodical, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. The desecrated graves sent a shockwave of fear through the investigation. What could possibly motivate such an act? If the villagers had fled, why would they take the time to unearth their dead? It made no sense. This clue seemed to point away from a panicked escape and towards something far more bizarre and ritualistic. It introduced an element of the macabre that went beyond a simple case of missing persons. It suggested a force or a belief system so powerful that it could compel an entire community to violate its most sacred traditions before vanishing from the face of the earth. The empty graves became a focal point for the darker theories about what happened at Anjikuni. Did the villagers dig up their dead as part of some strange, desperate ritual to ward off an encroaching evil? Or was this the work of whatever entity caused them to disappear in the first place? The image of the neatly piled stones is particularly chilling. It lacks the chaos of a panicked act or an animal attack. It speaks of a cold, calm purposefulness that is perhaps more terrifying than any violent struggle. The earth itself had been violated, and the spirits of the dead had been disturbed, adding a layer of profound spiritual dread to the already baffling physical mystery. In the face of such a bizarre event, authorities and investigators scrambled to find a rational, earthbound explanation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police conducted a thorough investigation, trying to piece together a logical sequence of events. One of the first theories proposed was that the villagers had simply decided to migrate to a new location. Perhaps a lack of game in the area or a particularly harsh season had forced them to seek better hunting grounds. This was a common practice for nomadic peoples, a perfectly normal part of their way of life. It seemed at first to be the most plausible and least sensational answer to the mystery. However, this theory quickly fell apart under the weight of the evidence. If the villagers had planned a migration, they would have taken their most essential belongings with them. They would have packed their sleds, taken their rifles, and, most importantly, brought their dogs. The scene LaBelle discovered was the exact opposite of a planned departure. It was a scene of sudden, total abandonment. Furthermore, an extensive search of the surrounding region and inquiries at other Inuit camps and trading posts turned up absolutely no sign of the missing villagers. They hadn't arrived anywhere else. They had simply vanished from the map. Another human-centric theory suggested that the villagers had been victims of foul play. Perhaps they were attacked by a rival group or fell prey to prospectors or trappers with ill intent. This could explain their sudden disappearance. However, this theory also failed to hold up. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere in the village. No bloodstains, no spent cartridges, no bodies. It's hard to imagine how an entire community of 30 people, including capable hunters armed with rifles, could be overpowered and abducted without leaving a single trace of conflict. It would have been a chaotic and violent event, and the village was anything but chaotic. A final, more desperate theory pointed to some kind of devastating, localized disease that caused mass delusion and hysteria, driving the villagers out into the wilderness to perish. This might explain their irrational behavior, such as abandoning their supplies. Yet no evidence of any such illness was ever found, and it doesn't explain the lack of tracks or the neatly opened graves. Every single rational explanation, when held up against the strange and contradictory facts of the case, crumbled into dust. The human world, with its understandable motives of survival, conflict and migration, seemed to have no answer for the silence at Anjikuni Lake. When rational explanations fail, the human mind naturally turns to the irrational, to the unknown. The Anjikuni Lake mystery is a perfect storm of bizarre events that seems to invite speculation about supernatural or extraterrestrial forces. The complete lack of tracks has led many to a chilling conclusion. The villagers didn't walk away, they were taken from above. The theory of alien abduction, while sensational, provides a neat, if terrifying, answer to how 30 people could vanish from the snowy landscape without leaving a single footprint. It accounts for the suddenness, the completeness, and the lack of a struggle. This paranormal theory is bolstered by anecdotal reports from the region around the time of the disappearance. Other trappers and members of the RCMP reported seeing strange, unexplained lights in the sky over the Anjikuni area. These were not the familiar shimmering curtains of the aurora borealis. They were described as pulsating, cylindrical or bullet-shaped objects that moved with unnatural speed and agility against the stars. Could these strange aerial phenomena be connected to the fate of the village? Did the Inuit witness something they weren't meant to see, leading to their silent removal from the world? It's a terrifying thought that resonates with modern UFO lore. Another branch of supernatural theory delves into the realm of folklore and ancient evil. The name Anjikuni itself is sometimes said to be linked to local legends of evil spirits or malevolent entities that haunt the land. Some have speculated that the villagers stumbled upon something forbidden or awakened a dormant power. The desecration of the graves could be interpreted in this light. Perhaps it was a desperate last-ditch magical ritual to fight back against an encroaching spiritual entity. Or perhaps it was the entity itself, consuming not just the living but the dead as well. This taps into a primal fear of ancient curses and things that lurk just beyond the veil of our understanding. These theories, while impossible to prove, persist because they offer a narrative that, in its own way, fits the evidence better than any conventional explanation. They account for the fear, the irrational actions, the lack of physical traces, and the sheer weirdness of the entire event. Whether you believe in aliens, spirits, or interdimensional portals, the story of Anjikuni forces you to confront the possibility that there are forces at play in our universe that we do not comprehend. The mystery becomes a canvas onto which we project our deepest fears of the unknown, of being small and powerless in a vast and sometimes hostile cosmos. Today, nearly a century after Joe LaBelle stumbled upon that frozen, silent village, the mystery of Anjikuni Lake remains as deep and impenetrable as ever. The official investigation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was eventually closed, the file stamped with the word unsolved. No bodies were ever found. No credible explanation was ever agreed upon. The fate of the 30 men, women and children of the Anjikuni Lake Inuit community is a ghost story written into the official records of Canadian history, a cold case that has grown colder with each passing decade. The silence that LaBelle encountered that day has never been broken. The story has been told and retold, becoming a cornerstone of North American paranormal lore. It has been embellished, debated, and even debunked by some who claim the entire event was a fabrication by a writer named Frank Edwards in the 1950s. Yet the core elements of the story, including the original RCMP reports of a deserted village and strange happenings, persist. The narrative has taken on a life of its own, a modern folktale rooted in the very real fears of isolation, the unknown, and the vast, intimidating emptiness of the northern wilderness. It speaks to our fear of vanishing without a trace, of our lives ending not with a bang, but with an eerie, inexplicable whisper. What truly happened on the shores of that remote lake in the winter of 1930? Did the villagers simply wander off into a blizzard, their tracks covered by the snow, their story later exaggerated? Were they the victims of a bizarre, undocumented human event? Or did they encounter something truly beyond our comprehension, a force from the sky or from the earth itself that erased them from existence? We are left with nothing but questions, with fragments of a chilling story that offers no resolution. The abandoned tools, the frozen stew, the starved dogs, and the empty graves remain as silent witnesses to an impossible event. The legacy of Anjikuni Lake is the chilling realization that some mysteries may never be solved. It serves as a stark reminder that our world may not be as orderly and understandable as we like to believe. Out on the edge of civilization, where the wind howls and the northern lights dance, the veil between the known and the unknown can be terrifyingly thin. The story of the lost village endures as a haunting question mark on the map, a testament to the 30 souls who stepped out of their lives and into a legend, leaving behind only an eternal frozen silence. Their story is a void, and into that void our darkest fears will forever rush in.